Here, the Health Secretary Sajid Javid has warned vaccine scepticism risks the protective wall built up from millions of jabs. He's taken to the Mail on Sunday after protesters confronted his family at home and in response to the global row over Novak Djokovic. It's been a fast-moving week for jab rows, and we've spoken to the hospital consultant who confronted Mr. Javid over mandatory vaccinations in the NHS. He's told us in an interview for this morning's programme that hundreds of staff support him and units will close in England over the issue. We'll hear from him just ahead. First, here's a quick scamper around what else has been said, starting with the French President Emmanuel Macron. He told a newspaper he wanted to piss off unvaccinated people. This was his response when asked to defend his rhetoric.
I stand by my earlier comments. We have a simple strategy. Vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. And this is also Europe's strategy. We can get too caught up by a turn of phrase that seems to be too slangy or casual, but I totally stand by it.
Meanwhile, Italy made COVID-19 vaccination mandatory for people from the age of 50 in an attempt to ease pressure on its health service and reduce fatalities. At home, Boris Johnson had these words for those who had still yet to get vaccinated.
How absolutely crazy it is. Absolutely crazy that there are 2 million slots this week for people to get vaccinated, and yet the majority of people in ICU for COVID are not vaccinated, 61%, and the overwhelming majority of those in ICU have not been boosted.
And this brings us to Friday, when the Health Secretary Sajid Javid had this exchange with consultant Dr. Steve James on a visit to King's College Hospital in London.
What do you think of the new rule to require vaccination of all NHS staff?
I'm not happy about that. So.
You're not happy about it? Tell me.
So I've had COVID at some point.
Yes.
I've got antibodies.
Yeah.
I've been working on COVID ITU since the beginning. I have not had a vaccination. I do not want to have a vaccination.
So you can see that there's a lot being said about this. We spoke to Dr. James this morning, speaking to us in a personal capacity. He said mandatory jabs in the NHS would lead to units closing.
My view is that we should not mandate vaccination. And it's the mandating that is the absolutely crucial point.
For the general, for NHS staff?
Well, the main topic, because it's only being applied to NHS and social care workers, because that's already been mandated, that's very important. It's coming in for NHS workers. But to say that normally go through this process of informed consent, where you weigh up, as the doctor, with the patient, the risks, the benefits, and that person's personal preferences. So different people will weigh up risks and benefits differently, depending on what matters to them. To take that process away and make it mandatory, that could happen, but under extremely, for me, extremely severe circumstances. And that would be something like the Ebola virus going around the tube and the population dropping like flies. And we are not in that situation now.
So what is your principal argument? Why don't you want it to be mandated?
So I've had vaccinations in the past, childhood vaccinations. I would just look at the risks and the benefits and then my personal preferences. So this is a very personal opinion, because if I say something about whether I would or wouldn't have a vaccine, that's my take on it. So it can't be applied to the population.
No, but have you had the COVID vaccine?
No, I haven't. I haven't had the COVID vaccine because initially we didn't have the COVID vaccine, and I was working on intensive care with patients who had COVID. Once the vaccine became available, I thought, well, it's going to be given to the vulnerable, and it's going to be given to all the different groups who we saw in particular presenting to critical care. And then as the sort of age groups came closer and closer to me, I thought to myself, there's a good chance I've probably been exposed to the virus, having worked with it on a regular basis since the start of the pandemic. I'm in a good, healthy shape, so I take care of my health. And I thought, well, let's see to ride this out. And maybe there are some issues with vaccination that will arise, and I didn't feel there was a rush to go and take it. So personal preference, didn't feel the need.
Right, because Because Sajid Javid is writing in the Mail on Sunday today, including about his exchange with you, pointing out that 90% of COVID patients admitted to ICU last month hadn't had a booster and 60% had had no vaccine at all.
The COVID vaccine has played a major part in the reduction of serious illness. The vast majority of patients have got risk factors for COVID-19 who are coming in and having serious illness. That's not to say that there aren't people who've been seriously unwell, but they usually haven't presented to hospital, or at least haven't presented to critical care, who haven't got any risk factors whatsoever. And I think the risk factors over time will be expanded as we understand it differently. So he's right to say that to give those figures, yeah?
Yes.
But that's not talking about each individual.
No, except that the article makes it plain that the UK Health Security Agency says the non-vaccinated are 8 times more likely to be hospitalised. And the Nobel laureate Sir Paul Nurse, speaking to our programme last year, made it plain there's a pro-social advantage to being vaccinated. You're vaccinated for other people, not just yourself.
Really, we should separate out those topics. So people like myself, I haven't seen a patient of my age and my level of health present to intensive care. So you've got to see that in the group that presents, it's effective. The second issue is transmission and the sort of pro-social argument. The vaccine will decrease transmission for people who've had the vaccine for about 8 weeks relative to people who haven't had the vaccine. That means if I want to have a clinically significantly better or decreased transmission compared with someone who isn't vaccinated, I'm going to need to be vaccinated more often than every 8 weeks. And that's quite something else. That's not comparing people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated compared with people who've had the virus.
Yes.
So I've had my antibody levels checked, and I know that I've had the virus. I've developed antibodies.
That is another way to do it, isn't it? Antibody checks, but we're not really doing that for the wider population. So are you concerned that your views could be used by anti-vaxxers?
The idea that people don't speak up because they're afraid that their views will be used against them suggests there's a culture of intimidation. I think it's very important to stand up and say what you think, and also to listen to what people say in response to that.
Yes.
So, it's sometimes a difficult position to be in. I know loads of colleagues, I've been written to by probably hundreds of people now since I made that interview, saying they are really thankful that someone had the chance to speak up. Many people would say the same thing as I've said. They just didn't have that opportunity.
I mean, that means if mandated staff, if it's mandated that NHS staff such as you must be vaccinated and they're not, do you suspect that the numbers who aren't are sufficiently high that hospitals would have to close?
Well, some units will. I've been written to by a group of midwives who say that I think it's 41 or 45 of them in their unit will all not be vaccinated. That means the entire midwife staff from one hospital are going to leave.
Well, that's Dr. Steve James speaking to me in a personal capacity this morning. We'll hear an alternative view at 9:30 from the Scottish Health Secretary. We'll also report from Australia on the row over Novak Djokovic ahead of his hearing, as a fast-moving few days for this row over vaccinations